out block 7. Block 7 and block 10 are virtually the same. They have a little section of the flying geese in the corner. So block 7 will actually go right here. And you can see that little section of the flying geese in the corner. And there's going to be a 7A, a 7B, and a 7C. You'll stitch 2 7As, 1 7B, and 1 7C. And the only difference is the fabric placement here in the corner for the flying geese. So the fabric will be in different orders. And the same with block 10. There's little flying geese in the corner. So let's get started with our block 7. Time to work on block 7, A, B, and C. So the video will be on block C. The difference is between 7A and 7B is really just the fabrics. Let me turn them the same way. The fabrics in the flying geese. They're in different orders. Everything else is entirely the same fabric sizes, same colors and everything. It's just your placements. So you're going to want to follow your directions very carefully and make sure you get these little fabrics in your geese in the correct place. This is also the same as 10 A, B, and C. And again, the difference would be where your fabrics are placed. So the supplies you need for block 7, actually all of them, will be your background fabric B, your battleizer, of course, hooped up, your background fabric B. This is my optional backing fabric, and this one is fabric 3. You'll need for the orange applique or the applique, you'll need a fabric 5. You'll also need a strip of fabric 5 because that goes into your geese, a strip of fabric 4, a strip of fabric 7, and a strip of fabric 6, and it'll be in different orders depending on what block you're using. You'll also need your optional wool if you're going to use it, your thread A, your thread B, your thread C with a bobbin, because that's your quilting thread, and then your regular embroidery bobbin thread. So let's take this to the machine and get sewing. Got my battleizer hooped up and on the machine, and I'm going to stitch step 1 for block 7, the placement stitch. Step 2 is to tack down our optional wool, and if you don't want to use the wool, you can skip to step 3. Step 3 is to place our background fabric B, centering it over the wool or the placement stitch, and continuing with water-soluble thread to tack it down. In step 3, it will also sew the placement stitch for all your various fabrics. Step 4, we're going to place our thread B in the needle only, and it will do some decorative stitches in some sections where the appliques won't be. Step 5 is next, and we're going to place fabric 4 covering this small area right here. And we want to make sure we have enough fabric extending into our seam allowance. So here's my fabric 4. It'll go right side up. I've got water-soluble thread in the needle, and we will tack this down. For the next few steps, I like to use just an Aurifil, a regular Aurifil sewing thread to do all of my seams for all the flying geese. So that's what will go on the machine next. So we're doing block 7C, so my next fabric is fabric 5, and it's going to go right side to my last fabric. So right sides together, raw edges even, and I will stitch the seam. And again, I do have my neutral thread I'm using as an Aurifil. Very short, tiny seam on this one. So I'm going to cut that nice and close. So that was step 6. Step 7 is to flip this fabric right side up and give it a finger press. So you have a nice straight seam. Keeping with the same thread, we're going to tack this down. And I'll just trim my threads and get them out of the way. Now I need to trim my fabric. So I'll just bring that off the machine a little bit. This edge is where my next seam is going to be. So I'm going to give that a scant 1/4 inch trim. This edge is an applique edge, so I'm just going to cut that off close right there. And this is my outside of my block. So this is going to get about a 1/2 inch. So the next step is step 8. So we'll put it back on the machine. Step 8 is to place my fabric 4, which is the background of my geese. On all of these, fabric 4 is the background of your geese. I'll place that right side to my last fabric with my raw edges even. Keeping with the same thread, I'll stitch the seam. Then I need to flip my fabric right side up, give it a finger press, smooth it out, and step 9 is to tack it down. And now I need to trim it. Get my threads out of the way. I'm going to bring it off the machine a little bit so we can get to it. So again, this edge is my applique edge. So this edge will get trimmed nice and close. This edge is the seam for my next fabric. So I'll do about a scant 1/4 inch. And then we'll put it back on the machine for the next fabric. Next step is step 10. And for block 7C, I'm going to use fabric 6. And I will place it right side to the last fabric with my raw edges even. Stitch the seam. Turn my thread. And then flip my fabric right side up and give it a finger press. Step 11, we'll tack this down. So now I need to trim it again. So I'm going to bring my hoop off the machine, keeping it on a flat surface. This edge here is my next seam. So this is going to get a scant quarter inch trim. Up here at the applique edge, we just kind of cut that little corner right off. And down here, we'll also give it a scant quarter inch. There we go. Now we'll get it back on the machine for the next fabric. Step 12 is my background fabric 4 again. So that will go right side to the last fabric. Stitch my seam. Get my threads clipped. Flip this right side up, finger press. Oh. So step number 12 is finger pressed out of the way. Step 13 is another seam with your background fabric 4. So you'll place it right side to this fabric with your raw edges even, and it'll stitch a very tiny seam. Get your threads clipped. And then you'll flip this right side up and finger press this. And step 14 is a tack down. Threads trimmed, and then we have to trim our fabric a little bit. So again, I'm going to bring the hoop off the machine a little. This area here is the edge of the applique, so we can trim that nice and close. And this is going to be the next seam, so we will trim about a scant quarter inch. And then down here, I'm just going to tidy that up a little bit. And back on the machine for the next goose color. Step 15 is next, and it's my next flying goose color. So I'll take fabric 7 and place it right side to that last trim seam with my edges even, and stitch that tiny little seam. And now we flip it up and finger press. And step 16 is a tack down. And we need to trim, so we just bring it off a little bit so I can get to it. Trim the threads. Now this area here is in your seam allowance, so I'm not going to trim here, but I am going to give this a scant quarter inch, and up at the top where the applique is, cut that point off. And now my last piece of fabric, step 17, will be to place my fabric 4 and stitch that seam. So we flip that up and finger press again. And then step 18 is another tack down stitch. And then the last final trim for our little flying goose section is to trim this applique edge right there. Step 19 is next, and we're going to take our fabric 7 and place it over this area right here, making sure it's centered and I can feel it. If you're not using wool and you can't feel it, obviously you can pull it back and take a peek. And we'll let it tack down. So now I'll need to just take this off the machine and get it trimmed. So down here by my seam, I'm going to leave my 1/2 inch. This is going to be an applique edge. So nice and close here. This is, again, my seam allowance, so I'll leave about a 1/2 inch there. And then this last edge is also an applique, so I need to trim that nice and close. So step 20 is next, and we need our fabric 5, and it's going to be the applique that's in this area here. So we need this big piece of fabric 5. Get it centered over your block with the right side facing up. Continuing with the water-soluble thread, we'll go ahead and stitch the tack down. Okay, so that's done. Now we need to trim this. This edge right here is an applique. That's where our flying geese are. So we're going to trim that really close. This edge is also an applique. So we'll continue trimming close. This edge here, where there's no stitching, is your seam allowance, so we leave that, as well as this edge here. This is your seam allowance. I'm going to trim inside the orange area because that's also an applique. So there we go. We have our seam allowance fabric in there. All our edges are trimmed nice and close, and our seam allowance here. So we'll put it back on the machine and continue sewing. We're at step 21, and we're going to use step C or D, depending on your fabric choice, to stitch the satin stitch in this area right here. Step 22 is also thread C and D, and it's going to do this edge of this applique right here. So I'm going to leave my thread in there because I'm using the same color, and we'll stitch that satin stitch. Step 23 is next, so I put thread B in my needle, and it will stitch the satin stitch to cover up these raw edges. Step 24 is next with thread A in the needle only, and it will stitch a flower leaf right here. Step 25 is to put the back on, and if you're doing our optional back with the different colored fabrics, you'll use fabric 3. So you'll place your back directly over your stitching, getting it centered, and smooth it out and put it back on the machine. Water-soluble thread in the needle, and we'll stitch our back on. Step 26 is the last step, and we are going to do our quilting, so we need thread C in the needle and the bobbin. So I've already got that in there, and we also want to make sure we go and turn our automatic thread cutter off if it happens to be on. Okay, mine's off, and then the next step to do is bring your bobbin thread up to the top. So grab a hold of both those threads and let the machine finish up your quilting. Block 7 is finished. We'll take it over to the cutting table and get it trimmed. We're going to give block 7C a trim, and as you can see at the top of the block I wrote 7C. You're going to want to do that on each of your blocks. It'll make putting this together in the end much easier if you know exactly what it is and where it goes. So each side of this gets trimmed by the trimmer by George. So we'll pull the front back. Lay the trimmer down. Trim off the edge. And I like to trim my two longer edges first. So then I will take my excess longer pieces and I'll zigzag them together and use them for another block. So we keep on trimming. So we've removed all the backing and battleizer from the back of the block. Now we'll trim the front of the block, leaving a 1/4 inch. So there's your block 7C.